Hi everyone, this is Lecture 11, Central Nervous System. So we are going to talk today about the central nervous system, in particular the regions of the brain and the spinal cord. In the end, we will then bring this all together to review the sensory and motor pathways that we began to introduce in the previous lecture, Lecture 10, when we talked about sensation. So the nervous system, again, is the master controlling and communication system of the body. The role of the central nervous system is integration. So it is taking the sensory information that comes in through the cranial nerves or through the spinal nerves, the peripheral nerves, through the spinal cord or directly into the brain, and then processing that information. We can process independently in the spinal cord, or the information can travel to the brain and be processed in the different regions of the brain. So overall, we have nearly gone through just about every part of this diagram for the nervous system. So last time we talked about sensation of stimuli through sensory receptors going through the afferent nerves, either the spinal or cranial nerves. Today we're going to talk about the brain and the spinal cord. We will finish up by talking about the efferent nervous system, or motor output either to the skeletal muscles or to the organs through the autonomic nervous system. So if we look at this in a very simple circuit diagram, we start with a sensory receptor. We go through an afferent neuron to activate a central nervous system neuron, which sometimes is indicated as an interneuron. From there, then we'll send motor commands out to the efferent neuron to have a response in an effector muscle or gland. So the central nervous system tissue is very easily damaged. It has to be well protected from trauma and from harmful substances. So there are three ways to protect the brain and the spinal cord. First are the skull and the meninges. Second is the cerebrospinal fluid. And third, special to the brain, is the blood-brain barrier. So first, and you should have learned all of these structures in your anatomy course, but just as a review, there are the bones of the skull, which protect and surround the brain. So here you can see the skull covered by the scalp and the hair. Once inside the skull, there are tough connective tissue membranes that wrap around both the brain and the spinal cord. And you can see them here around the brain. So this thick white layer is the dura mater, which is the outermost layer of the brain. In between the dura and the innermost layer is the arachnoid layer, which you can't really see much here, but we will zoom in just a moment. The arachnoid layer then leads to the pia mater, which is right on top of the brain tissue. The cerebrospinal fluid is another way that the brain is protected. So the cerebrospinal fluid is formed by the choroid plexuses in the ventricles, and those are shown here, where you can also again see the layers of the dura, arachnoid, and then the pia will be right on top of the brain. These indentations here are part of the arachnoid, and they are called the arachnoid villi. So cerebrospinal fluid is formed by choroid plexuses, and it's about 125 to 150 milliliters total surrounding the brain and the spinal cord, and it's replaced about 3 times per day. Cerebrospinal fluid 1 creates a fluid cushion around the brain that will absorb sudden shock if there's any sort of jarring movement. So head trauma, stopping quickly, knocking your head on something. So very jarring movements where the brain might jiggle in the fluid keeps it from moving too much. The other way that the cerebrospinal fluid protects the brain is to have very limited exchange between the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood. So the exchange of materials and fluids between the cells and the glia and the interstitial fluid is very, very tightly regulated to make sure that the central nervous system has very low potassium outside the cells, high sodium outside the cells, and very few proteins compared to the blood. This all occurs because of the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is a highly selective network of specialized capillaries that prevents substances from entering the brain. So it's a layer of capillaries that has tight junctions. Those capillaries are surrounded by astrocytes. There's a large astrocyte star-shaped glial cell here, and ependymal cells. So the ependymal cells protect the brain by preventing most substances from entering. So it prevents blood-borne pathogens from getting in, so bacteria, etc., certain hormones from entering, and certain toxins from entering the brain. It is anything that is lipid-soluble, or oxygen, carbon dioxide, alcohol, and water can cross the blood-brain barrier, but other substances such as glucose, amino acids, and ions that the brain does need will have to be actively transported by the very selective membrane carriers. If there are no carriers for a particular substance, then that substance cannot enter the blood-brain barrier. So one of the reasons for the tight regulation of the blood-brain barrier is that neurons have very specific metabolic requirements. They are reliant mostly on oxygen and glucose for their metabolism. So the oxygen can diffuse across the blood-brain barrier, and under normal circumstances, glucose will be the only energy source for neurons. So glucose is transported from the plasma into the fluid by insulin-independent membrane transporter. So insulin is not required for glucose to get into the brain. Low blood glucose or hypoglycemia can lead to confusion, unconsciousness, and in the extreme case, even death. So if the metabolism of the central nervous system is oxygen and glucose, what type of metabolism is that? Think back to your metabolism lectures. Yeah, so it's aerobic metabolism that we studied that occurs in the mitochondria, requiring oxygen and glucose. Okay, so functions of the brain now. So we are going to get into the individual regions of the brain. Once we finish the brain, then we will talk about the spinal cord. So the brain overall is regulating homeostasis. It is sending commands out to the body and listening to what is happening in and outside of the body to be able to respond appropriately with the right commands. It is also regulating emotion, movement control, sensory perception, memory, and cognition, or what we refer to as higher thought, awareness, and judgment. So what I want to remind you of is that the central nervous system is functioning as a circuit. So even though we're going to go through one area at a time, and I'm going to show you guys, generally what the function of a particular region of the brain is, these functions are dependent upon the whole circuit. So there are connections coming in that form its input, there are connections going out that form its output, and it's really as a whole that these areas are functioning. So even though we look at each area individually, I want you to remember that it is only one part of many of the connections that make up an entire circuit of information flow throughout the central nervous system. So before we get into that, we have to review a couple of terms. So the gray matter in the central nervous system we refer to as nuclei. So these are mostly cell bodies, synapses, dendrites, neuroglia. So a nucleus, if we talk about, for example, the red nucleus down in the brainstem, then that is a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system. A ganglion is a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. When we talk about nerves, we're referring to the peripheral nervous system. That's white matter or myelinated axons connecting regions of the peripheral nervous system. If we talk about tracts, that's myelinated axons within the central nervous system. So if you take a frontal section of the brain, you will see regions of gray matter that appear to be darker, sometimes pinkish, sometimes grayish in color, and regions of white matter that are myelinated axons, sometimes crossing over to different regions of the brain and connecting different regions of the brain. So I am going to present the brain regions as functional brain regions. The alternative is to do it as a developmental organization, and I prefer not to do that. So we are going to start from a top-down view from the cerebral cortex all the way down to the brainstem. So we're going to go from the cerebral cortex to the basal nuclei to the thalamus, then the hypothalamus, cerebellum, and the brainstem, and go from there. So if you remember your general anatomy, you may remember, depending on how your instructor presented it to you, this outer region of the brain is the cerebrum. Here we have a big landmark, which is a huge white matter structure, the corpus callosum. There's one of your ventricles, which will contain cerebrospinal fluid. That is one lateral ventricle. And then below that, I always call this the seahorse. So see if you guys believe me. This looks like the head of a seahorse. There's the nose, or the cheeks of the seahorse. There's the pointed nose of the seahorse. Here would be the neck of the seahorse, belly, tail. Do you see how this all looks like a seahorse? Here, and then this region in the back, this sort of feathery looking structure, is the cerebellum. So the seahorse type structure are what we refer to as the lower areas of the brain. So we have the cerebrum on the outside, and then here we have the thalamus, which makes up the head of the seahorse. Here below the thalamus is hypothalamus. On this diagram, it's cut off. It's not shown, but on other diagrams, you will see that hanging down from the hypothalamus would be the pituitary. It would be right around here. And then the neck of the seahorse would be the midbrain. The belly of the seahorse is the pons. And then the last structure before we get to the spinal cord is the medulla oblongata. All of those three structures, the midbrain, pons, and medulla, make up the brainstem. So first we'll start with the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the largest, outermost region of the brain. It's divided into 4 lobes that are colored here in different colors. So the front of the cerebrum is the frontal lobe. The side of the cerebrum, right around where the ears would be, is the temporal lobe. The top side is the parietal lobe, and then the back of the cerebrum, the occipital lobe. This down here is the cerebellum, and there's the brainstem underneath. So when we look at the lobes of the cerebrum, we have some major dividing anatomical marks. So right here, dividing the frontal and the parietal lobe is an important division, which is the central sulcus. Okay, the cerebrum can be divided into primary and other areas. So we generally refer to these as primary cortex areas. So the lobes of the cerebrum have different functional regions for the integration of the information that is being processed within the cerebral cortex. Often the cerebrum is just shorthand referred to as cortex. You'll hear that a lot. So primary regions are responsible for very simple, direct, and conscious processing of a single type of stimulus or command. So for example, you will see within the occipital lobe, there's an area called the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex takes in vision information from the eyes and has simple processing of light on and off. Is there light or is there no light? And simple patterns of light entering the eyes. The primary visual cortex is going to respond very simply to light stimuli. And then you will see other names for cortical areas within the cerebrum. So we have the primary auditory cortex that will respond to simple sounds, so different pitches of different tones of sounds coming in through the ears. The primary olfactory cortex is going to respond simply to smell. The primary somatosensory cortex will respond simply to touch stimuli in different areas of the skin sensations, general senses. And then the primary motor cortex is going to be a simple motor command out to skeletal muscle. So these are simple processing areas that have one singular function, either vision or auditory or olfactory, etc. And they will be then the first stop for cortical integration. After that, information will then get processed to higher and higher areas before it ends up becoming a response. So we have higher sensory areas, well, that will be more elaboration and processing of sensory input, and then association areas that will be even further integration of sensory input. So in general, we refer to these as complex cortical association areas. So these are regions that are next to or near the primary cortical areas that will integrate multiple sensory stimuli, multiple motor stimuli, add memory and emotional stimuli integration. So the best example I can give you is if the primary association area is going to give you a pattern of information, a pattern of lights, then the association area, visual association area, will be the actual recognition of the image that you see. So the primary association area will be the light, primary association area. The primary visual area will be the lights and the different patterns that you're looking at. And then the visual association area will be the processing of that image. Say, that is my grandmother. That is a picture of my grandmother. You'll also have auditory associations, olfactory association areas, where you're going to bring in all of the other sensory and emotional and memory stimuli and put it together with that basic primary information to say, oh, that's my grandmother. And now I'm going to associate it with all of the other wonderful things that are associated with my grandma, the smell of her spaghetti sauce, the cookies that she makes, all of that kind of thing. So we have visual association areas, auditory association areas, olfactory, somatosensory. Then we also have association areas or specialized areas for motor. And these are generally sort of planning, decision-making areas for movement. So we have premotor cortex, which is planning and deciding what movements will be sent out the primary motor cortex. We also have emotional areas that have complex emotional and social processing. So there's an area called the prefrontal cortex that will be higher order emotional processing in the front of the brain. And then we have language areas, which are more complicated sensory and motor areas, some for movements to speak, some for listening to speech, and some for looking at or reading speech. So there are some diagrams, this is from a different textbook, but I love this image and it's nice that it's color-coded, that will actually show you where these different areas are. You may be wondering, how do we know what these areas do? So the way that this is actually done is that various different recording can be done of the cells in these regions, particularly from human epilepsy patients or patients that have tumors. They have done human surgical recording because they need to identify areas for tumors, where they'll go in and they'll put an electrode in a certain region of the brain and they'll map it out. And when they stimulate here, the patient will say, oh, I see flickers of light. And so that's going to be primary visual cortex. Or when they stimulate here, the patient will say, I hear a song that I remember. And so that would be an auditory association area. So one by one, let's go through the lobes, and I'll show you the major areas in each of the lobes of the cerebral cortex. So the occipital lobe, this area in the back, has the primary visual cortex, which will be basic vision and light. It's going to receive sensory input from the retina, which contains the photoreceptors in the eye. Its function is the perception and processing of light. And then this area nearby will be the visual association areas, which will be more complex processing of visual information. For example, once I see that light, I can then process the pattern of that light and say, oh, that's a cat, or that's my grandma. The temporal lobe is the lobe here. It's been pulled back to show another lobe, the insula, but the temporal lobe is here, and the main regions in the temporal lobe are auditory areas. So there's a primary auditory area here, and then auditory association area nearby. So the primary auditory area is going to be the basic sensory input from the ear, so the tones of the sound waves that are coming in, and then the auditory association area will be the more complex association of interpreting that sound into context. That's my favorite song, or that's a dog barking, or something like that. In the frontal lobe, then we have some major motor areas. So if you find the central sulcus here, which divides the red and blue regions of this diagram, the central sulcus and forward, all of this is the frontal lobe. So the first region, or this precentral gyrus, contains the primary motor cortex. And this is basic voluntary control of skeletal muscles. These neurons cross over before they head down to the muscle, or down the spinal cord to the final motor neurons controlling the muscles. Because of that, this left side of the brain will control the muscles on the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain will control the muscles on the left side of the body. So we call that contralateral control, where if a patient has a stroke that is affecting the left side of the primary motor cortex, that patient will have paralysis or lack of movement in the right side of his or her body. In front of the primary motor cortex, we have some more complex association areas. We have the supplementary motor area, which helps with sequences of movement. So maybe ballet dancers might have a very good supplementary motor area. The premotor cortex, which is a lot of learned and planned movements. Then behind the central sulcus, or in the post-central gyrus, we have the primary somatosensory cortex, which now we're in this blue region in the parietal lobe. So all of this is parietal lobe, and the first part of the parietal lobe is primary somatosensory. So somato for body and sensory sensation. So these are your general senses. So general processing and perception of body sensations and proprioceptive input from your skin, joints, and muscles. Behind that area, we have the somatosensory association area, which will be more complex patterns. So the primary somatosensory cortex might be, there is a touch felt on my finger. The association of the somatosensory association areas might be, oh, that is something soft, or that is something rough, or I feel a blanket. That might be more of the association or attributing the texture and shape of something that you're holding, for example. So to look at it from the top view, I wanted to show you guys again, here's our dividing area, which is the central sulcus, and that divides the frontal from the parietal lobe. The pre-central gyrus is your primary motor cortex, and your post-central gyrus is your somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. If we take a little cross-section of these areas, what is super cool is that as the information is coming in to the somatosensory cortex from different areas of the body, it will have these labeled lines that we talked about when we talked about sensation. So the fingers, the hands, the arm information is all going to travel up particular nerves to go to a particular area of the somatosensory cortex. Your feet, legs, those are all going to travel up particular areas to go to particular parts of the somatosensory cortex. So if we take a little piece of the somatosensory cortex here, and we record along it or ask, what does this area respond to? And we find what's called a homunculus. So here in blue, there's your parietal lobe again. And if we march through the parietal lobe with different stimulation electrodes or different recording electrodes and find out what each area responds to, we find a little map where the inner regions of the somatosensory cortex are feet, ankles, legs. The outer regions are going to go more towards face, nose, lips. The middle region will be hand, fingers, etc. And this looks like a tiny little human when you map it all out because it's mapping out the whole body, and that's why it's called a homunculus, or a tiny human. We have the same kind of mapping that happens for the motor commands that are sent out to different control of skeletal muscles, and it's interesting, it's very similar, matching on the other side, but these will be nerves that are going to be, tracts, and then nerves that will be exiting out of the body. But we have a similar map on this side where we have toes, feet on the inner part of the primary motor cortex, hands, neck, eye, face on the outer parts of the motor cortex. And areas that are larger tend to have more brain space dedicated to them, and so these areas will be more sensitive. So you know that your lips are very sensitive, your fingertips are very sensitive, your forearm not so much, and we're actually going to test this in lab. So here's a closer view of the somatosensory homunculus, if you're curious there. And here's another closer view of the motor homunculus, or the tiny map in the motor region of the brain. Also in the frontal lobe, in addition to the motor areas, we have what's called the prefrontal cortex, right in the very front of the brain. If I hadn't pointed out to you already, this diagram is a patient facing to the left. So the eyes would be here, the ears approximately here, this would be the back of the head, this would be the front of the head. So the prefrontal cortex is right in the front of the brain. So this is an area that's involved in social and emotional planning and integration. Now that's something that's very difficult to test, but we know from patients that have damage to the prefrontal cortex that they have very strange and unusual emotional and social behavior. So it's very interesting case studies about patients with damage to their prefrontal cortex. So this area is involved with intellect, reasoning, judgment, concern for others, personality traits, and management of emotions. It develops much later in life and is impacted very much by social environment. It's very tightly linked to emotions and the limbic system, which I'll show you guys in a bit. Another specialized group of areas in the cerebral cortex are the language areas. So these are near and dear to my heart because what I studied for my PhD were similar areas for birds. So birds, in addition to having birds, just like us, have little speech areas, but they have singing areas, not speech areas. So these, for humans, are the speech areas, and we have one here, which is between the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe. This is Broca's area, and this is for speech production. So it's near the regular motor area, and this is for actually doing the muscle coordination of tongue, mouth, lips, vocal cords required for speaking. And then here is an area called Wernicke's area. And I remember this one because actually sometimes when you look at it in the diagrams, it looks like a little ear. And it's here on the back of the temporal lobe here. And it is involved in actually listening to or processing speech and language. So in order to speak properly, we have to both hear and process the speech, and we have to then send out the appropriate commands. And I studied this really similarly in birds. So birds don't have Broca's area and Wernicke's area, but they have singing areas that take up a good portion of their brain. So that's what if anybody's curious about what I did in my research, I studied singing areas of the bird brain. So I think the language processing areas are a great example of thinking about something from a circuit view. So here we have primary auditory cortex, which is important for hearing words, and then that will combine with primary visual cortex, which will send vision, so seeing words. Both of those primary areas will send information to Wernicke's for speech processing. So Wernicke's is kind of like an association area, but because we know very tightly what it does, we can give it a special name for speech processing. So once we listen to and read words, we can then respond to them through Broca's area. So Wernicke's will send information to Broca's area, which we can then use to send commands to the primary motor cortex, which will send commands out to the muscles, tongue, and facial muscles to actually speak. So we can summarize the areas of the cerebral cortex in this diagram, and since we went through each one very, very carefully, I'm just going to leave this diagram in the PowerPoints for you guys to refer to later. All right, so from the cerebrum then, let's get into the other areas of the brain. So just below the cerebrum are the basal nuclei, sometimes also referred to as the basal ganglia. This is gray matter deep in the cerebrum. And the basal nuclei are important for integration and fine-tuning of motor, sensory, and emotional input. So many functions of the basal nuclei, and the research is continuing on the basal nuclei, but we know a lot about the basal nuclei because they are affected in Parkinson's disease. So if you know anybody who has Parkinson's disease, they generally have a tremor, and they have a tremor when they stop and start movements. So if they're going to reach for something, a typical Parkinson's tremor will be they have a really hard time initiating a movement, so they'll have a tremor as they're initiating, but once they start the movement, they're good. And if they then try to stop the movement, they'll have a tremor or difficulty stopping the movement. So Parkinson's affects this coordination, which is the stopping, starting, and intensity of movements that would be coordinated by the basal nuclei, between the basal nuclei and the cerebral cortex. There's a lot of sensory and motor processing in addition in the basal nuclei, and some new research is looking at a region of the basal nuclei called the amygdala for emotional processing, particularly in the fear response, some autism research, some PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder research. They're all looking at the amygdala now for emotional processing. So behind and below the cerebrum is the cerebellum. Cerebellum kind of means tiny brain. So it looks like this tiny little brain behind the cerebrum. So the cerebellum is also important for movement, and what it is important for is balance, movement planning, and movement execution. So if you ever watch the way a baby walks, you will see that babies don't have a well-developed cerebellum. It takes a couple of years for the cerebellum to really learn all of the appropriate things it needs to learn. So if you think about the way that a baby wobbles and is out of balance, that is all because the cerebellum is not fully developed yet. So the cerebellum is important for balance and movement planning and execution. It's very highly folded region just below. Here's your occipital lobe back here in the back of the brain. To do this, it has to receive visual, body, where your body is in space, and cortical input. And it is subconscious. We don't have any voluntary control of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum will take sensory input from proprioceptors, visual and vestibular or equilibrium pathways, and put that together with information from the motor cortex, or what movement planning is being created in the cerebrum, and it will coordinate what movement you want to do with where your body is in space, and put that all together to create fluid coordinated movements. So people with cerebellar problems will also have tremors, but they will have different tremors than Parkinson patients. They will have constant tremors. Okay, now we get into the lower regions of the brain. So we did cerebrum, there's a little piece of it there, there's cerebellum there. Basal ganglia you can't see in this diagram, you need a different section to see the basal ganglia, but they would be sort of gray matter deep to the cerebrum. And now we're going to go below this corpus callosum, or this big white matter structure, into the lower areas. So this region here is the thalamus. This is what I was calling the head of the seahorse. So the thalamus you will see a lot, because all of the sensory information, not all, but most of the sensory information that comes into the brain has to first be gated by the thalamus. So we call the thalamus the gatekeeper. It is going to filter, process, and decide whether sensory information is important enough to send up to the conscious processing regions of the cerebral cortex. So there is a lot that we are unconsciously filtering out that we don't pay attention to, because the thalamus is not sending it up to the cerebral cortex. So it is filtering, processing, and relaying sensory information to the cortical regions. It's basically screening, or it's the gatekeeper for sensory information, deciding what should be passed on to the cortex and where, what areas should it go to visual or auditory regions of the brain. The hypothalamus is a tiny but very important area of the brain that is below the thalamus. It controls, in general, homeostasis, and of course that is a huge function, but the way it does that is linking the nervous system to the endocrine system and to the organs. So there's endocrine and organ or autonomic input directly to the hypothalamus to regulate the internal body environment. So these are all the functions of the hypothalamus. It is the autonomic, or the organ control center in the brain. So it is going to send the autonomic input through the brainstem and the spinal cord out to the organs. It also has some basic emotional functions. It can regulate body temperature, sleep-wake cycles, hunger, water balance and thirst, and secrete various hormones to the pituitary. So when we get into the endocrine system, I think you guys will have an even greater appreciation of just how important this tiny area of the brain is, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface now. Okay, we also have a system in the brain, the limbic system, that is an emotional processing part of the brain. So it is a circuit of several regions, including the basal nuclei, the thalamus, particularly the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. There's also association cortex that seems to have a general emotional region within the cortex. So the limbic system is a sort of newer research system that we are currently seeing more and more research going on because of the interest in autism and PTSD and other emotionally or social related disorders. And what we believe the limbic system is doing is affecting motivation, basic emotions, social behaviors, sexual behavioral patterns, basic survival and instinctual behaviors. For example, if you stimulate this part of the limbic system, or the amygdala, the patient experiences sensations that they will report as fear sensations. So really fascinating area, the limbic system. Okay, so below the hypothalamus, now we can get into the last region of the brain before we get into the spinal cord. So this is the brainstem, which is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Within the brainstem, we have something called the reticular activating system. This is a fascinating part of the brain that is basically another filtering area. So this reticular formation region is important for attention and arousal of the cerebral cortex. There's some control also of sleep-wake cycles. So what the reticular system, or the reticular formation, is doing within the brainstem is sending impulses out, generally to the cerebral cortex, to increase attention and increase arousal states. The midbrain then is the superior portion of the brainstem, and it contains a couple of structures that you may remember from your anatomy course on the back of the midbrain called the superior and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculus is an important region of visual reflexes. The inferior colliculus is an important region of auditory reflexes. Also within the midbrain, many white matter tracts of axons going to and from through other regions of the brain. The pons is this bulging region then between the midbrain and the medulla. It is anterior or in front of the cerebellum, so it's this region here. So within the pons there are many areas, but one of the most important areas we will hear about is the pneumotaxic respiratory center, which works with the medulla to maintain rhythmic breathing. Then the last bit is the medulla. So last but not least, the medulla is a very important region of the brain, which is the base of the brainstem. So it contains large motor tracts, so large white matter that will cross over before they continue down the spinal cord. Those initially came from the primary motor cortex. So there's going to be information traveling through the medulla to control skeletal muscle. There are also the olives, the medullary olives, which will send information to the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So you'll see those in some of the pathways between the cerebrum and cerebellum. And then there are very important organ or autonomic controlling nuclei or regions within the medulla. You will hear about the cardiovascular center, which adjusts heart rate and blood pressure, and you will hear about the respiratory center, which controls the rate and the depth of breathing and works with the pons together for rhythm. There are other regions of the medulla that have other important reflexes, for example, the vomiting reflex, the swallowing reflex, coughing, sneezing, hiccups. All of those reflexes are controlled by different regions within the medulla. So we did a top-down view, and we can work our way up now. So from the medulla, pons, midbrain, up to the thalamus, hypothalamus, with the cerebellum off to the back of the brain. The basal nuclei would not be shown, but they are pulled out here so you guys can see them in the diagram. And then the largest region of the brain, the part that gets the most press because it's the conscious or the part of the brain that we have awareness of, is the cerebral cortex. I'm going to leave this here for you guys as a summary figure that summarizes the major functions of each of these regions of the brain. So this is from your textbook, Table 5.2, page 145. So the last thing I'll say about the brain before we move on to the spinal cord is that it can exhibit plasticity. So the architecture of the cerebral cortex, or the organization of the cortex, so like the mapping that I showed you where the different areas are, is determined by genetic and developmental processes. But there's some really fascinating research going on right now that shows that the organization of the cortex can be modified due to how much activity is in a particular area. So we call this use-dependent competition So for example, there's some really interesting research in blind patients that are obviously not using the primary visual cortex because they cannot see. So there's no retinal input to the visual cortex. Well, the brain doesn't just get rid of that area. The brain uses that area and other areas will creep in on the visual area. So for example, they found in some research studies that auditory information will be found in the visual cortex of blind patients. So really fascinating reorganization that can happen based on how the brain is being used. There can also be formation of new pathways and connections between existing neurons, and some regions of the brain can be remodeled throughout life. This research is ongoing. We don't know how strong the remodeling can be yet, or how often new cells can actually stay within the brain, but the research is very cool. So if you guys are interested in that, something you might want to check out. Okay, so the brain is one part of the central nervous system. The other part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is the pathway between the body and the brain. And we already discussed this in our sensation lecture. It contains the ascending and descending nerve tracts of the central nervous system, relaying information to and from the brain. It can also, on its own, initiate basic reflexes completely independent of the brain. So just like the brain within the spinal cord, there are maps of information, and a cross-section of the spinal cord has many functional areas, some going up to the brain, which would be ascending, and some going down from the brain or descending. So we could talk about these pathways for a very long time. There are many of them. The mapping of the spinal cord is something that if you get into, for example, in your health sciences career, if you get more into spinal health, the mapping of the spinal cord is fascinating. We're not going to get into every tiny region of the spinal cord, but I am going to show you some examples. So in general, what we talked about in the sensation lecture is that sensations come in through the dorsal spinal cord. Okay, so here is a muscle stretch receptor sending information to the dorsal spinal cord. That information is then traveling up the spinal cord, through the brainstem, to the cerebellum, or up the spinal cord, through the brainstem, and then up to the thalamus, to the cerebral cortex. So now you know that this sensory information can be gated by the thalamus, or it can be gated by the brainstem or the medulla. And then that information, then, depending on how strong it is, can be relayed to the cerebellum to help with movement coordination, or it can be relayed to the cerebrum to be aware of the sensation, and then further decide whether we should have a response. And then the primary motor cortex will send out commands descending down through the brainstem. They will cross over to control the opposite side of the body, and then go out of the ventral root of the spinal cord to control skeletal muscle. So the gray matter and the white matter regions of the spinal cord can be very carefully mapped based on these sorts of pathways, where we have the sensory information coming into the dorsal part of the spinal cord, the motor information coming out of the ventral part of the spinal cord, and then interneurons within the gray matter, and then tracks, ascending or descending tracks within the white matter of the spinal cord. So the dorsal horn contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. Contains the cell bodies of interneurons on which the sensory neurons will terminate. The lateral horn will contain the cell bodies of autonomic and efferent nerve fibers, and the ventral horn will contain your efferent or motor nerve fibers. So in areas of the spinal cord where you see a large lateral horn, that's where you have a lot of input going to the organs. This mapping I'm going to leave for your curiosity, but I'm not going to test you guys on every tiny region of the spinal cord. I just find that some students really want to know, if you have a spinal injury that's this deep, what would you affect? If you have a spinal injury that's this deep, what would you affect? What if you were to section the entire spinal cord or have a damage to the entire spinal cord? What kind of injuries could you expect? So these are the kinds of pathways that you see throughout the spinal cord. Ultimately, the spinal nerves will exit out of the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramen, and there are 31 pairs of those. If you want a review of these, you'll want to return to your anatomy and go back to the sensations lecture. There are dermatomes, or specific regions of the body, that are innervated by specific spinal nerves. So these are important clinically, and damage to a particular spinal nerve or a dorsal root ganglion in a particular region of the spinal cord will produce a specific pattern loss because of this mapping that's maintained throughout the spinal cord. So for example, if you have a patient that is complaining of pain in the pinky, ring, and middle finger that is radiating up the wrist, then you can generally, the ring finger and the middle finger that is radiating up the wrist, then you can say that they may have damage to a nerve in the C8 region. If they have damage to the pinky finger that is radiating up the elbow, then you can look at the spinal T1 spinal nerve. So these maps, here's the front of the body, here's the back of the body, can ultimately show us how the mapping of the spinal cord then is created by the mapping of the nerves. We also have the cranial nerves, which connect directly to the brain rather than through the spinal cord. And if you want a review of these, go back to your sensory lecture or your anatomy slides. So overall, we have sensory, motor, and reflex pathways that are involving the integration of the central nervous system. So a sensory pathway is sensory input to the spinal cord and brain. It's going to provide information on internal and external changes in the stimuli. It is an afferent and ascending pathway. Motor pathways are motor responses based on a central nervous system decision, so what is happening within the cerebrum, which can be voluntary or involuntary, meaning we don't know that it's happening, to change activity in a skeletal muscle, organ, or gland. These are efferent and descending pathways. Finally, a reflex is a simple pathway that involves only the brain or only the spinal cord and is involuntary. It's a very fast, predictable motor response to a simple sensory stimulus. So let's go back to our sensory and motor pathway examples and draw them out so that we can see how you guys are following our overall circuits. Okay, so we will start first with the sensory pathway. So what you will have is, in this example, what did we say? A thumbtack, right? So there's this sharp thumbtack that pierces your skin. So here's your stimulus, and that causes pain. That pain is going to travel through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root ganglion, and into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So there's your dorsal horn, there's your ventral horn, one side of the spinal cord, there's the other side of the spinal cord there. Let's draw the whole spinal cord around it. So through the dorsal root ganglion and then into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and that information is then going to be sent up the afferent sensory pathway. In this case, it's going to travel up the brainstem, up through the medulla, cross over, and then head to the thalamus. From the thalamus, it will then be sent to the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. And that is where we had that homunculus within the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. So we had a painful stimulus travel through a sensory receptor, through the dorsal root ganglion, through the dorsal horn, and then up the spinal cord, through the brainstem, to the thalamus, and then ultimately end in the somatosensory cortex. From there, we will send out a motor command in response to this painful stimulus. So you'll be aware of the painful stimulus in the somatosensory cortex, and then the brain will decide whether to respond to that stimulus. So right next to the somatosensory cortex then, we'll send information to the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex will send axons down through the brainstem. They will cross over to the other side to control the opposite side of the body because it's contralateral control. So if this was the left side of the brain, this was the right side of the brain, they'd be controlling the left side of the body. If this was the left side of the brain, it'd be controlling the right side of the body. And that information is going to travel through the spinal cord, through the descending pathways of the spinal cord, and then out the ventral root. And then you can respond appropriately. For example, you may want to walk away from the painful stimulus. You're going to go sit down on a bench to get away from it. We also talked about sending information out cranial nerves to say ouch. So these will be going to the facial and tongue muscles to speak information out. The ventral root would be going to skeletal muscle, lower down in the body, so that's why I'm saying walk away, etc. Okay, so hopefully you guys at this point have seen enough regions of the brain, enough regions of the spinal cord, and enough pathways to get a good feeling for how the sensory information comes into the central nervous system, where it can be processed through different areas of the brain, how then the areas of the brain can send out motor commands to control skeletal muscles, and we're going to talk next time about the overall control of the skeletal muscle and the efferent nervous system. So not just skeletal muscle, but also organs. So we will see you in a bit.